Okay, so we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for coming to the session today. This is session ID HUM M03, Droned Out, Surveilling the Noise in the Russian War in Ukraine. My name is Alexander Leslie. I'm an Associate Threat Intelligence Analyst with the Advanced Cybercrime and Engagements team at Recorded Future. My research is primarily focused on the intersection of U.S. national security, U.S.-Russia relations, and cybercrime. And at Recorded Future, I'm responsible for maintaining a great number of clandestine personas on Russian language, dark web, and special access forums in order to collect human intelligence that's uploaded directly to the Recorded Future platform. As a quick disclaimer, of course, statements of facts and opinions expressed are those of the participants, aka me, and unless expressly stated on the contrary, are not the opinion and position of Recorded Future. Recorded Future does not endorse or approve and assumes no responsibility for the content, accuracy, or completeness of the information presented here today. So there's going to be a couple presentation goals I have. The first being to acquaint yourselves with the public-private partnership and the role of collective defense on an international scale, not only in defending Ukraine against Russian aggression in cyberspace, but also defending Ukraine's public and private sector partners that are providing intelligence to Ukraine throughout the war. Two, we're going to look at the history of Russian offensive cyber operations, and we're going to examine the historical military doctrine by which Russia openly collaborates with cyber criminals. We're going to understand how events in the cyber criminal underground immediately preceding the war actually served as pretext or signaling and could have been used to predict some of the offensive cyber operations that we had seen from February 24th, 2022 to February 24th, 2023. We're going to drone out misinformation and misconceptions. There's a lot of speculative reporting, a lot of misinformation, particularly when it comes to cybercrime and hacktivism and the effect that hacktivism has on kinetic operations. So we're going to address all of that and provide you with some verifiable findings as to how the cybercriminal threat landscape has actually evolved in the last year. And then, of course, we're going to talk about mitigations, a multi-layered risk mitigation framework for which we can better protect ourselves against threats, particularly from Russian cybercriminals and hacktivists in cyberspace. So as a brief outline, of course, we're going to do introduction, research questions, and background, research and analysis, get into our findings, and then conclusions. So for those of you who are not familiar with Recorded Future, we are the world's largest intelligence company, and by that means we are the largest company that openly collects text-based and signals-based open source and closed-sourced intelligence, and not only when it comes to cyber threat intelligence, but threat intelligence on a geopolitical level, intelligence when it comes to influence operations, and we have been incredibly active in support of Ukraine throughout the last year. We are frequently publishing IOC lists. We are frequently publicly disclosing threat actor infrastructure, hosting webinars, public-facing research reports, and things like that, where we're disclosing a lot of the infrastructure and TTPs that are used by Russian threat actors to target Ukraine and its allies. And of course, we're working very closely with public and private sector partners located around the world in order to provide information to Ukraine on a daily basis. And a lot of this has culminated in an official memorandum of cooperation between Recorded Future and the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. We are also working very closely with Ukrainian organizations and the Ukrainian government to advance hiring initiatives and, of course, releasing a lot of public reporting. So some of you might have read these three reports, Themes and Failures of Russia's War Against Ukraine, Russia's War Against Ukraine Disrupts the Cybercriminal Ecosystem, and Dark Covenant 2.0. These reports are available on recordedfuture.com for free. I highly recommend you read them. This presentation is going to synthesize the key takeaways from all three of these reports, and all of the data, all of the findings, all of the open source reporting that I'm going to reference today is laid out in detail, cited in these three reports. So again, recordedfuture.com, highly recommend you read these reports if you haven't already. So I'm going to be talking a lot about disruption today. This is going to be the key theme, and it's actually the first key takeaway of this presentation. Recorded Future has identified disruption to nearly every single form of commodified cybercrime as a direct or indirect result of the war in Ukraine. And when I say commodified cybercrime, I'm referring to organized as a service cybercrime. So malware as a service, ransomware as a service, DDoS as a service. We've seen changes to not only the infrastructure, but to the supply, the demand, the price, and the threat actors that are selling their services as a result of the war. And there's many reasons for this, often due to internal insider leaks and political disagreements over reactions to the war, an IT brain drain, arrests and website seizures, and more that we're going to talk about today. But I'm going to be saying disruption a lot, and this is kind of how we are going to frame our conversation moving forward. So when we think about who are the key intelligence customers in Ukraine right now that can use actionable intelligence in order to better their defenses, these are going to be, among others, the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Cyber Police, CERT-UA, and the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Now, behind these emblems and behind every Ukrainian organization is something really incredible, and that is a public-private partnership of hundreds of tech organizations around the world that are providing 24/7 support to Ukraine in order to strengthen its defenses. One of the biggest goals that Vladimir Putin had when he invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022 was to take Kiev as quickly as possible, install a new government, and diminish Western support, diminish private sector support for Ukraine. He has failed. Over a year later, Ukraine still stands. The public-private partnership is stronger than ever, and it includes a robust international coalition not only of governments, but of thousands of companies around the world that are actively supporting Ukraine, that are complying with Western sanctions, that have withdrawn from the Russian market. And of course, one of the biggest initiatives that I think a lot of us are familiar with is Shields Up. So this is an initiative on behalf of CISA to engage in the public sharing of cyber threat intelligence in order to better the security of our industry and of Ukraine. They've released a great number of cybersecurity advisories that I highly recommend you check out. We're going to talk about both of these in depth. The leadership of Director Jen Easterly has been incredible in being transparent and open in sharing a lot of this data through these bulletins, through these Stop Ransomware advisories. So again, highly recommend that you check these out. In the first bulletin that we see, Russian state-sponsored and cybercriminal threats to critical infrastructure, there are a couple organizations that are laid out that I want to acquaint you all with. The first, of course, being Russian intelligence services. So from left to right, you see the SVR, the GRU, and the FSB. The SVR being the Foreign Intelligence Service. The GRU is the main directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, or military intelligence. And then the FSB is the Federal Security Service, their primary domestic and international law enforcement service. Down below, I have a bunch of threat actor naming conventions that are interchangeably used in order to describe threat activity that's been attributed to these organizations. There has been a lot of debate in the threat intelligence and information security community over the last week about the use for threat actor taxonomies and naming conventions. I understand the point to a lot of defenders that attribution in the initial stages of a security event doesn't really matter as much as remediating the threat and of patching and defending. It doesn't really help a whole lot when a threat analyst goes to a CEO and says that Seashell Blizzard is in their systems. Doesn't really help kind of the overall risk mitigation framework, but attribution really does matter. So a lot of those arbitrary names that you may see attached to threat activity really does ascribe motive, it ascribes strategy, as each of these organizations have different missions that then, when you are able to attribute to, say, the SVR, has a very different legal mandate than that from the FSB. So attribution matters not only in post-mortem IR reports, but in reports moving forward, because it is able to allow us to strategize, to think about TTPs, to think about shared infrastructure moving forward. The bulletin also lists a number of cybercriminal groups that we are going to talk about today. All of the things that you see with SPIDER is a CrowdStrike naming convention for financially motivated threat actors that we are going to address today. And of course, I think we should address up front the question of, has Russian threat activity actually been effective in Ukraine? And the answer is largely no. So we believe that with regards to kinetic operations, Russian cyber activity has failed to augment the situation on the ground. It's failed to augment Russia's ability to take control of any territory. Any threats of attacks on critical infrastructure have been remediated. Threats from non-state actors, particularly cybercriminals and hacktivists, have gone largely unnoticed and are easily mitigated. But when it comes to actually meeting the expectations of if this kind of cyber activity is implied to have some kinetic effect, I don't think it actually was intended to do that in the first place. So Russia has a military doctrine that's called New Generation Warfare or Next Generation Warfare or the Information Confrontation. And in the words of Anatoly Serdyukov, the former Minister of Defense, the information confrontation is the confrontation between two states in the information space with the intent on creating psychological manipulation. So cyber activity in Russia's doctrine, not only strategically but legally, falls under a dimension of warfare called temporal warfare or psychological warfare. It is not intended to actually cause any kinetic effect on the ground. It's actually intended to sow fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and present itself not only to combatants but to the public as if it actually is having a kinetic effect when it might not actually be having a kinetic effect. So this is an important strategic framework that we're going to think about moving forward, because when we talk about Russian state collaboration with cyber criminals and hacktivists, largely of which have little to no impact on Ukrainian infrastructure, the question is, are they actually intended to have impact on Ukrainian infrastructure? And the answer is likely no. That's not the purpose, but rather to control the media narrative and to control the perception of Russia's cyber capabilities. So here are some research questions to kind of guide the more substantive quantitative research that we're going to talk about today. So over the first 100 days of the war in Ukraine, Recorded Future identified approximately 700,000 references to cyber threat activity claimed by politically motivated threat actor groups on the internet. For those, again, not familiar with Recorded Future, a reference is a base unit of measurement. So when data is ingested into the Recorded Future platform, the Recorded Future AI and natural language processing systems extract things like names, dates, locations, threat actor groups, and then ascribes a single reference to all of those events. So we see 700,000 individual references to claimed threat activity in the first 100 days of the war in Ukraine. Now that number rises to 1.2 million references over 6 months, 2 million references over 9 months, and about 2.5 million references over the first year of the war in Ukraine. Now, something very interesting you'll see on the graph all the way on the far left, there's a significant spike of activity in March 2022. So of all activity that we see over the last year claimed by cybercriminal and hacktivist groups in the context of the war in Ukraine, 350,000 references come in March of 2022, or approximately 20% of all content, all data that we looked at over the first year. This brings up questions of, do threat actors have a very short attention span? Did they get distracted? Were their mission objectives achieved? We'll address all of that later, but it's something to keep in mind as we move forward. In this graph, you see approximately 250 threat actor groups that we tracked, 100 of which per day. You're looking at thousands and thousands of victims located in 75 countries around the world, 24 US states, and nearly every federal subject of Russia, with the exception of the autonomous ethnic republics in the North Caucasus, the Urals, and the Russian Far East. So, of course, this brings up the questions of which groups of these 250, of these 2.5 million references, actually claim responsibility for the most attacks, and which groups claim responsibility for attacks that result in the most impact. How has the war changed the cybercriminal and hacktivist threat landscapes, and what is the risk? How can we mitigate it? So when it comes to setting a background for cyber activity in the context of Ukraine, there's a lot of debate over when we actually begin that timeline, when we begin the research timeline or the historical timeline for contextualizing Russian offensive activity. Some people say 2022, some 2014 with the onset of the war in Donbass, 2008 with the Russo-Georgian War, or even all the way back to 2007 with Russian attacks on Estonia. I think 2007 is a little far removed from this war in particular, even though it is a landmark incident. But where we actually begin the timeline is on September 29th, 2021, with the arrest of Ilya Sachkov, the co-founder and former CEO of Group IB. So for those who are not familiar with Group IB, it is a Russian cybersecurity company. It announced this week that it is exiting the Russian market permanently due to the last several years of I guess harassment is a good way to say it. Ilya Sachkov was arrested on September 29th, 2021 by the FSB on charges of treason, for which to this day we still don't actually know what the charges stated. It's still classified. There's been a number of open source reports. RBC said that he provided false testimony to the FSB. Bloomberg reported that he provided information to the Department of Justice on APT 28. None of that has been confirmed to this day. I think the issue that Ilya Sachkov ran into was that he was very outspoken and he was very opinionated, and specifically he was outspoken over Russian state collusion with cyber criminals. So in a June 2020 press conference with Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, Ilya Sachkov said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Russia cannot be taken seriously on the international stage when it comes to cybersecurity because it openly collaborates with cyber criminals, particularly ransomware operators, individuals like Maxim Yakubyets, the alleged leader of Evil Corps, is driving around Moscow in a Lamborghini with a license plate that says thief. Therefore, how could we possibly take ourselves seriously considering the fact that we openly allow ransomware operators to operate in our borders? This did not go over well, not only with the Russian government, but with the Russian cybercriminal underground. When these comments were made, Russian language forums like XSS, Exploit, Verified immediately called him out for breaking the unwritten rule, and that is, there is an unwritten rule in Russian cybercrime in that Russian cybercriminals, if they do not make it known that they are Russian and they do not target Russia, they will never be arrested. Ilya Sachkov called this out, and therefore they considered this to be a break of the rule. Group IB was immediately DDoSed by hacktivists. So, the argument that we have here is that Ilya Sachkov's arrest actually establishes a precedent as we move into 2022. His arrest is one of many Russian tech professionals, including professionals at Yandex, Kaspersky, and also Group IB, who have stated very openly that they don't agree with Russian policy of collaboration with cyber criminals. Therefore, the best way to maintain plausible deniability on behalf of the Russian state is to silence their critics almost immediately. So we've seen a wave of arrests following Ilya Sachkov of Russian tech professionals who have openly stated, hey, I don't agree with this activity, that the GRU is using cybercriminal personas or it's using commodity malware, and then have been arrested or put under house arrest. So keep this in mind as we move forward, because arrests are going to be a big theme throughout this presentation. Fast forward a little bit to January 14th of 2022, and we get a kind of unprecedented event in Russian cybercriminal history, and that is the arrests of the REvil or REvil affiliates in Moscow and St. Petersburg. This is unprecedented because this is the first time ever that the FSB acknowledges in a cyber operations case that it is conducting arrests at the request of the US Department of Justice. So this is pretty unprecedented, not only for its political implications, its foreign relations implications, but just that it is the first time the FSB acknowledges at the request of the FBI they conducted these raids. Now, 8 individuals were arrested, 9 raids were carried out throughout Russia. 8 individuals is not a large number for the grand scheme of things when we think about REvil or REvil, when we think about how many affiliates and staff members they have. At its peak, there were between 30 and 40 full-time REvil staff members. There were approximately 300 affiliates and affiliate crews. 8 people, I don't think, is even a drop in the bucket. So There's 4 reasons why Recorded Future believes that these arrests were sham arrests intended to control a media narrative. The first being the evidence provided by the FSB was unsatisfactory, provides nothing more than evidence that this was a cash-out operation being used by REvil and other ransomware affiliates. 2 being that, and again, I don't condone doxing, but many of the affiliates as part of REvil have been doxed, their identities have been released, and the names of the individuals arrested by the FSB do not match that of doxes of REvil affiliates that have been reported in open sources. A lot of the TAs, a lot of the threat actors that worked with REvil are still active to this day. The keys to the public REvil ransomware extortion blog still exist. It came back up last year as blog XX, in which the Australian Federal Police immediately said that yes, this is REvil, and yes, this is being done at the direction of the Russian state. And the 4th and most important reason is as REvil was being taken down on January 14th, 2022, Whispergate was deployed. So Whispergate is a wiper that was developed by the GRU that targeted a number of Ukrainian and Polish websites. DDoS attacks, defacement attacks on Ukrainian websites were going on at the same time as REvil was being dismantled. So the question here is, what exactly was the motive? Was it recruitment on behalf of the Russian intelligence services to recruit individuals into the FSB, the GRU, the SVR? Or is this an attempt on behalf of Russia to control the media narrative and say effectively that, hey, we're not cooperating with cyber criminals whatsoever. Please do not pay attention to this wiper being deployed. Look at this huge, amazing thing, this unprecedented event in which we conducted these arrests. I think that is likely the explanation. There were another series of arrests on January 22nd, where again, at the request of the FBI, the FSB arrested Andrei Novak, who ran UniCC Shop, a very major Russian carding shop. And then on February 7th of 2022, there was a significant takedown of Russian carding shops. So what you're seeing here is a banner from Directorate K of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation seizing Skyfraud, Trump Stumps, UAS Shop, and Ferrum Shop all went down on the same day. Now, these names might not mean anything to you, but in the course of our research, in the course of adding up all active listings, there were approximately $500 million worth of payment card and credential data on these 4 shops that had gone down in one day. This is a significant disruption on behalf of Russia. So when we think about why Russia would actually conduct these arrests, there are 2 schools of thought. One being that this is a show of good faith on behalf of the Russian security services, that they are capable of handling cybercrime, that they're able to get a handle on cybercrime if it gets out of control. And the second, of course, being that this is a move to enable further plausible deniability. This is a move to control the narrative. There's been speculation for years on end that Russia collaborates with cyber criminals. Let's stomp that out right now by conducting a series of arrests and saying, hey, we can't be working with cyber criminals because look at all these arrests and seizures that we just had. So amid all of these arrests, the Recorded Future platform starts to pick up something very bizarre, and that being credential leaks from Ukrainian domains on dark web sources. So another unwritten rule in the cybercriminal underground is not only can you not target Russia, but generally you cannot target individuals and entities located in the Commonwealth of Independent States or the former Soviet Union, of which Ukraine is not a member of the CIS formally. If you post Ukrainian credentials on Exploit or XSS or BHF, you will be banned immediately. So then why, for some reason, in February of 2022, are we starting to see credentials pop up for Ukrainian entities on Russian language sources? In the entirety of Q4 2021, we only identified 2,500 compromised accounts in database breaches and malware logs related to Ukraine on dark web sources. So 2,500 total in Q4 2021. In the month of February 2022, we identified 14,500. Why on earth is such a massive increase happening during the month of February? 10,000 of these credentials, of which come between February 12th and 24th of 2022. And you see it spike there on the right. Well, a lot of it has to do with database breaches. So these are two screenshots from raid forums of threat actors selling Ukrainian databases in the days preceding the invasion. On the left, you have a threat actor that has been with moderate to high confidence associated with the TrickBot and Conti ransomware gangs, which have connections to the FSB. On the right, you have a threat actor that mimics Russian hack and leak operations, which recorded future assessed with moderate confidence is a Russian state-sponsored persona. And then you have Free Civilian. On February 24th, 2022, about 90 minutes before the invasion begins, Free Civilian shows up on raid forums, drops an onion link with approximately 30 databases relating to Ukrainian government entities. So in Q4 of 2021, we identify 7 total databases affecting Ukraine on dark web sources. That number rises to 55 in February of 2022. Why on earth, again, for this increase? Well, Free Civilian has been since attributed by CrowdStrike to Ember Bear, or Lorik 53, UAC 0056, a Russian state-sponsored hacking organization with ties to the Russian GRU. So in all of this activity that we're seeing, if we go back to the graph, in all of this credential activity, in all of this database activity, is it cyber criminals capitalizing on impending unrest? Likely not. It is a Russian state-sponsored hacking group, a Russian hack and leak operation, and a cyber criminal that has ties to the FSB through the Conti and TrickBot malware development groups. So now we get into kind of our key findings. The first being, again, I've said this before, plausible deniability. What is plausible deniability? It's the ability for a security service to conduct clandestine operations and then if they are busted, immediately wipe their hands clean and say, we have nothing to do with this whatsoever. There is no evidence linking this back to the Russian state. When we use the case study of Free Civilian, among others, and we kind of look at the data, we look at the evidence that links it back to the GRU. It is very clear that Russia, in these cases before the war, are masquerading as cyber criminals, and therefore now cyber criminality in the context of the war has to be viewed as an extension of the Russian state. This is going to be the framework that we are going to adopt when we are talking about the war in Ukraine moving forward. And this precedent continues throughout the last year. So in November, the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center disclosed Prestige ransomware. In their note, Prestige ranusomeware, so they cannot spell. But Prestige ransomware has been attributed to Sandworm, which is also linked to the GRU. ESET Labs attributed RansomBogs or James P. Sullivan ransomware to the GRU as well. What we are seeing all the way back here with Ember Bear, which is also the GRU, continues throughout 2022 and into 2023 with Russian security services impersonating cyber criminals, masquerading as cyber criminals, masquerading as ransomware groups, because it's a very natural fit for a lot of them who moonlight as cyber criminals. Another key finding that we have is group instability as a result of the war. So when we say Russian cybercrime, we're not really referring to cybercrime restricted to the Russian Federation. There is a brotherhood of cybercriminals located throughout the CIS that speak Russian, that don't target the CIS itself, they don't target each other's countries. In any given ransomware group, say you're looking at Conti or Lockbit or Black Basta, they will have affiliates from Russia, but also from the Baltics, from the Caucasus, from Central Asia, from Russia's near abroad, like Romania, Poland, and Finland, Mongolia. This brotherhood is united behind the fact that we don't target Russia, so Russia is not going to engage in any investigation or disruptive acts against us. So naturally, though, there actually are Russians that are in a lot of these groups. And when February 24th rolls around, Conti declares allegiance to the Russian state. This is not received well at all within Conti. So almost immediately, researchers and cybercriminals alike begin leaking Conti's internal group chats. They begin conducting something called the TrickBot leaks, where they are doxing members of Conti. This precipitates a number of insider leaks across the Conti threat actor nexus, which eventually leads to Conti's dissolution in May of 2022. So now Conti exists as a number of threat groups, Royal, BlackByte, Quantum, Black Basta, a lot of the ransomware threats that you're dealing with your organization that might seem diffuse and not related whatsoever, all have a relationship to the Conti ransomware gang and, of course, the larger umbrella parent organization, which is TrickBot. So when Conti dissolves, Conti immediately begins working with the Russian state to target Ukraine. Initial access brokers that operate Iced ID, which is Conti's primary initial access vector, their primary piece of malware that's used to facilitate initial access, is immediately used by the GRU, SVR, and FSB to get into organizations in Ukraine. And this, of course, leads to, on February 9th, 2023, US and UK sanctions against TrickBot, against Conti, against any of Conti's relatives, by saying very openly in the sanctions announcement that Conti is openly working with Russian intelligence services to target entities in the US and in Ukraine. So again, when we talk about plausible deniability, when we talk about group instability, what we have here with Conti is that its dissolution actually leads many threat actors to work with Russian intelligence services in order to in terms of their newfound unemployment, make some money and contribute to a patriotic cause. There are a number of leaks when it comes to insider threat groups over the last year, whether that be Conti, Lockbit, Yanliu Wang, Solaris, Ursnif. Almost every single one of these major groups have had internal chat leaks as a result of political disagreements over the war. Again, even though a lot of these threat groups speak Russian, a lot of them are attributed to Russian infrastructure, there are a lot of people in Russia and there are a lot of Russian speakers around the world that are opposed to Russia's invasion. Therefore, any kind of declaration of allegiance, any suggestion that these groups are collaborating with the Russian state is not received well by members of these groups who are opposed to the invasion. A next kind of big thing, and this is going to cause a lot of stress for a lot of CTI analysts, but hacktivism is a major topic that has come to the forefront again in 2022 and 2023 as a result of the war. So when the war starts on February 24th, we begin to immediately see hacktivist alliances form. There is much more ideological diversity on the pro-Ukrainian side of the house than there is on the pro-Russian side of the house, which is really just pro-Russian with some nation-state support kind of sprinkled in. On the Ukrainian side, we have, pro-Ukrainian groups, pro-Belarusian groups, Russian partisan groups, pro-Western groups, even some hacktivist groups that are attacking Russia and Belarus that claim to be pro-NATO, which is kind of one of the strangest things, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then there are some spoilers that get involved that begin conducting attacks for political purposes, but they're actually ego-driven or they're financially motivated. And of course, this causes a lot of confusion and a lot of complication for threat actors and for analysts that are analyzing hacktivism. So we do have to talk about Anonymous, which pains me because it's not 2003, but Anonymous, this is not the same Anonymous of that era. So when we think about Anonymous, we think about Project Chanology, about the Habbo Hotel raids, about 4chan. What the Anonymous is now is not even remotely the same as it was in the 2000s. Anonymous is now a largely diffuse set of previously established cyber criminal groups that are engaging under similar hashtags on social media, under an anonymous banner, but in reality have no relationship to the historical lineage of Anonymous whatsoever. So these are groups like GhostSec, DoomSec Against the West, Kelvin Sec Team. These are primarily cybercriminal groups. These are primarily financially motivated groups that have seen the war in Ukraine as a potential for them to make some money and get some media publicity on the side. Another reason we need to talk about Anonymous is because the brand has also been co-opted by a lot of pro-Russian groups. So defenders have been concerned a lot lately with groups like Anonymous Russia and Anonymous Sudan, which form a collective with Killnet and Hacknet and other pro-Russian groups. These groups have nothing to do with, again, Anonymous or its lineage whatsoever, much like the pro-Ukrainian side has nothing to do with Anonymous and its lineage. So in order to kind of demonstrate the differences between these groups and demonstrate as to why so many of them spread misinformation, I'm going to provide 2 examples of groups that are not only DDoS crews, but hack and leak crews. And we'll start with hack and leak crews first. So an example of a group that actually does something, that actually is a hack and leak hacktivist operation that has tangible impact, is a group like Network Battalion 65. Which was formed in March of 2022 and was made very famous by hacking the Russian all-state television and radio broadcasting company, leaking about 10 terabytes of data, of Russian government data, onto a number of leak repositories. Network Battalion 65 uses a version of the Conti ransomware as a wiper. Basically, it will go through the exact same ransomware kill chain that we're all familiar with, the initial access, the lateral movement, the privilege escalation. It will run the same kind of tools from the Conti playbook, Bloodhound, Mimikatz, things like that, which naturally takes a lot of effort, a lot of skill, and a lot of money for a threat actor to actually do. So we don't really see a whole lot of activity out of Network Battalion 65. We really only see 4 or 5 major breaches over the course of a year because a small group conducting attacks of that sophistication is very difficult. But we've been able to verify everything that NB65 did as unique and as legitimate. While NB65 is conducting these 5 attacks, we have groups like Against the West, who is claiming responsibility for 120 attacks, 0 of which have actually been verified. So Against the West is kind of your foil example of a hack and leak operation that is primarily financially motivated, primarily ego-driven, has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, but claims to be involved in the war in Ukraine for money. Against the West formed in 2021. It claimed responsibility for approximately 130 database breaches, 0 of which have ever been verified, and they have since been banned on the now defunct RAID forums, on Cracked, on Nulled. Getting banned on those sources is very difficult because it's kind of like skidware sources, like a lot of people breaking into cybercrime, making false allegations, and getting banned is a pretty monumental thing to do. So props to Against the West for doing that. When Recorded Future reached out to Against the West asking for proof of these 130 databases they claim to have exfiltrated, they told us kindly to F off. So we'll never see those databases, unfortunately. So when it comes to DDoS on the other side of the aisle, a group that has actually done something very significant is the IT Army of Ukraine. The IT Army of Ukraine formed on February 26th of 2022 and has claimed responsibility for attacks on thousands of Russian targets. Many of those attacks still persist to this day. Their DDoS attacks have been able to take Russian websites offline for days, weeks, even months at a time, sometimes permanently if there is no DDoS provider. Russian cybersecurity hygiene standards are not at the same level as they are here in the West, and there has been a significant IT brain drain of individuals, which effectively means that IT Army of Ukraine has conducted a number of attacks that have been successful, even with their own custom tool sets that are built especially for them that are fully undetectable. When you go up to things like hybrid analysis, triage, VirusTotal, and you look at some of the malware that's developed custom for IT Army of Ukraine, it will have no antivirus detections because it is bespoke malware customly made for this group, which means it's far more effective. A group of a bunch of liars that make every CTI analyst's head hurt every time they see them is a group like Killnet. Killnet is a Russian hacktivist group, I guess you can say, that forms an early alliance with Hacknet and the Cyber Army of Russia, both of which have been attributed by Mandiant and Google to the GRU, to Sandworm. The claims made by Killnet are overwhelmingly false, misleading, or exaggerated in impact. Killnet has claimed responsibility for over 1,400 attacks on Ukrainian and Western websites. About 98% of them, per Recorded Future data, are false. The threat of Killnet, though, is not these attacks. The national security threat of Killnet is its ability to enable information operations. So Killnet has a very close relationship with nation-state hacker groups, has a very close relationship, for some reason, with Russian state-sponsored media like RT, Sputnik, TASS. For some reason, people like Margarita Simonyan seem to know that Killnet attacks are happening before they are even publicly disclosed, which is very suspicious. But of course, Killnet's threat is more so its ability to enable the spread of disinformation rather than its ability to conduct a successful DDoS. So in all of these findings, when it comes to politically motivated groups, about 60% of all attacks are on Russian individuals and entities, with DDoS resulting in 94% of all instances that we've identified. The IT Army of Ukraine by far has claimed responsibility for the most attacks with the most impact. We've been able to site verify approximately 150 IT Army of Ukraine attacks. Primary industries targeted, of course, include the Russian financial sector, the Russian government, and infrastructure. And then again, there's that thing that I said earlier. 85% of all attacks that we've identified in the first year of the war took place in March 2022. Now, the question is, well, has this threat gone away? No, it has not. A lot of these groups are still active, but the volume of groups and the diversity of groups in their targeting, again, March 2022. When it comes to anonymous, 32 groups we've identified, only 4 are actually claiming responsibility for attacks that result in anything. So some of the final key findings that we're going to see here is to the underground economy. Malware as a service has been significantly disrupted as a result of the war in Ukraine. This is a screenshot from Raccoon Stealer on XSS, claiming that they are suspending their operations as a result of the special military operation. We know that is not the case. Raccoon Stealer's operator, Mark Sokolovsky, was arrested in the Netherlands, fleeing conscription in Ukraine. Life lesson, if you are an internationally wanted cyber criminal and you're fleeing lawful conscription, don't have your girlfriend live stream your location on Instagram because you will be arrested very quickly. The exit of Raccoon from the market has significantly disrupted the malware as a service. We're seeing things like Mars, RisePro, Radamanthus, Titan, Phoenix. The list goes on, starting to fill that void. And of course, in all of this, in all of these new InfoStealer variants, we have some state collaboration. Mars Stealer was used by Gamma Raiden. Radamanthus has been linked to Sandworm. Titan Stealer has been linked to the GRU. So we're seeing this influx of new variants of malware as a service offerings, almost all of which are actually Russian state fronts. We're also seeing a rise in cracked malware on Russian language sources. People don't want to deal with malware brokers anymore, so they're getting cracked malware. A lot of this malware is actually malware in itself. Threat actors are infecting each other right now, and their data is appearing in malware logs on the dark web, which is very funny. And of course, a rise in bespoke malware products. So a lot of custom, fully undetectable malware products are being developed right now as a response to this disruption. When it comes to dark web shops and marketplaces, so this is a screenshot from Russian Market, which is one of the major credential stores, we are seeing a near 5-fold increase in all leaked credentials, all payment cards, and all PII data on dark web shops and marketplaces following the war in Ukraine. Now, are threat actors burning their infrastructure? Are they dumping everything possible in order to have some kind of marginal reward, given the risk that they've taken with regards to the war? We don't really know, but this influx of data has caused price destabilization. And now with the sanctioning and seizure of Genesis Market 2 weeks ago, the dark web shop and marketplace system is significantly disrupted with a near 10-fold increase in all data, most of which is actually junk data. When it comes to physical goods, so we're thinking physical like contraband, guns, drugs, things like that, we see Hydra go down. We don't see any sufficient replacement actually come in for Hydra. We're seeing a lot of fake dark web marketplaces. So this was a screenshot showed at the United Nations Security Council by the Russian permanent representative saying that cyber criminals are selling javelins in Ukraine for cryptocurrency. This website went down about 30 minutes after that UNSC meeting. So we're seeing a lot of marketplaces that are completely illegitimate, that are popping up and going directly down. Some, like Black Sprut, are advertising on billboards in Moscow. It's very bizarre. But regardless, we're seeing about approximately 1/2 of all active listings dropping off of Russian language dark web marketplaces. And the reasoning for this, of course, is sanctions, border closures. It's very difficult to actually ship contraband out of Russia now to places like Canada, the US, and Germany. Therefore, they're opting for dead drop services within Moscow and St. Petersburg, leading to a destabilization, of course, in the dark web marketplace's effect on Western cybercrime. Of course, a lot of the money laundering schemes, BitsLotto, a lot of the mixers, Blender.io, Tornado Cash have also been sanctioned. Therefore, the ability for which threat actors to actually launder their funds and to use them is becoming diminished as these continue to be sanctioned, as these continue to go down. Payment card fraud is a bit of a different beast. We're seeing spikes in payment card fraud due to sanctions. Visa and MasterCard exit the Russian market. Sberbank is sanctioned, of course. We're seeing the ruble collapse, Moscow Stock Exchange collapse, and this has led to a need of Western payment cards. And in this payment card data, we're seeing a lot of threat actors using it for online services because you can't really use a compromised American Visa in Russia anymore, so they're using it for like Netflix subscriptions and things like that. And then, of course, ransomware is going to be the final thing that we talk about today. Ransomware has said that it's largely apolitical, but it absolutely is not. We're seeing a change in ransomware victimology away from things like manufacturing and tech towards critical infrastructure. We're seeing an increase in targeting of hospitals, schools, universities, federal governments located around the world. And the reasoning for this is because ransom payments in volume, frequency, and price are down this year across the board. Threat actors are not making as nearly as much money as they were in 2022. This is leading to desperation. Therefore, even though this is a good thing, ransomware operators are not having that many victims publicly disclosed on their blogs. The negative effect is that in order to support this infrastructure and their lifestyles, they're now targeting entities that if you don't pay, there will be real-world consequences, like targeting a hospital. We're also seeing a rebrand of Russian threat actors to Chinese personas. Daijin Team, Yan Liu Wang, Pian Lian, Qi Lin. A lot of these threat actors claim to be Chinese. They conduct negotiations in Chinese. They claim not to speak Russian. We know that is not the case because some of these groups have had internal leaks of their chats, and for a bunch of Chinese guys, they only speak Russian in their internal group chats. So funnily enough, a lot of those Chinese threat actors that you see running around are actually Russians in disguise. So the last point is that partial mobilization is having a massive effect on dark web culture. Following September 21st, 2022, when partial mobilization was announced, we see a 30 to 75% decrease in all activity on Russian language sources, this being all new posts, all new threads, all new registrations, and all new active users. Reasoning for this, naturally, is that partial mobilization has actually led to conscription efforts, an IT brain drain of approximately 100,000 tech professionals, and a lot of the people that moonlight as cyber criminals just don't have activity on these forums anymore. With breach forums going down, we're seeing this kind of rebound in total activity as a result of English language cyber criminals infiltrating Russian language sources, but that's about it. So, of course, to kind of reiterate what I had said already, the brain drain, the mobilization, and of course the disruption to nearly every single form of commodified cybercrime is a direct or indirect result of the war in Ukraine. We are seeing a number of false, misleading, or exaggerated claims. We are seeing a lot of misinformation being spread by cybercriminals and hacktivists. And of course, in order to get through all of this noise, in order to break down these misconceptions, we again need to work together. The public-private partnership has been incredible in its transparency and its openness, disclosing threat actor infrastructure on social media, disclosing IOCs and public-facing reports. We need to do more of this because the more that we actually do this, the more of this narrative we disrupt. So a parting thought that I have for you is that there's been some proposals at the Russian State Duma lately with regards to absolving criminals and hacktivists of administrative and criminal liability if they engage in cyber activity on behalf of Russia. This is a very dangerous proposal that we need to keep an eye on because everything that I told you about plausible deniability, about state collaboration, about cybercrime and its independence from the state or its codependence with the state. All of that goes out the door if legally nation-state attackers with the SVR, GRU, and FSB can openly work with Russian cyber criminals, openly recruit them, and use commodity malware in terms of their operations. So that's the parting point that I have for you. There's a lot of stuff that I threw at you. All of the data is in those reports that I referenced earlier on recordedfuture.com. And of course, I'm willing to take any questions now or questions offline afterwards out in the hallways if you have any. Thank you.